Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about nuclear physics later on in the day when we talk about the age of the Earth question. But hey, good morning. It's really great to be back in Portage. I keep wanting to say Portage, because I'm one of those Eastern Canadians that lives right next door to Quebec, and we were taught that you should say Portage, so it's Portage. I got to remember that. But I have been here before. Not here, but here in Portage before. So that's cool to be back. And it's good to see so many people out here on a Saturday to get into this. So let's get into it. The first talk this morning is the talk we typically give at a morning church service, because it's kind of a general thing that tries to kind of point out why this is an important topic for Christians, because a lot of Christians don't think it is. And I called the talk Origins by the Book, because it would seem books tend to figure quite significantly in this question of origins. Now, I think it's fair to say we've really got basically two accounts of our origins that are competing for people's allegiance these days. One of those is creation. The other one is evolution. Creation, of course, is described in this book. There's the first connection to books. The book of Genesis, in fact, the first book in this book. And while there are a lot of books that have been written on the topic of evolution, when people think about evolution, probably the book they immediately think of might even be considered to be the Bible, for evolution is the one that Charles Darwin wrote on the origin of species. Now, these two books have two quite different accounts of our origins. So that naturally prompts the question, which is right? They're so different they can't both be right. Some people think that science has proved evolution. Is that right? Then there are those who say, well, how can anybody, well, at least anybody in their right mind, actually believe the biblical account of our origins? And some say, well, does it really matter? Because after all, isn't the gospel the important part of Christianity? But these are all pretty legitimate questions, and I'm going to try and address them during the day, at least, if not the first talk. But first, I'd like to tell you a story about this guy. You might recognize him. He's an author. He wrote a lot of books. Some of those got made into movies, and one of those caused quite a stir within the church. That particular story was based on this painting by this artist, and the movie starred this actor. Okay, you've all probably figured out the story was the Da Vinci Code, which would make this guy Dan Brown. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Da Vinci Code. We're not going to do a book review, but I would like to talk about something that Dan Brown said in an interview he gave to a trade publication around about the time the movie came out. He said, I was raised Episcopalian, and if you don't recognize that word, that's what the Anglicans in the U.S. refer to themselves as. And I was very religious as a kid. Then in the 8th or 9th grade, I studied astronomy, cosmology, and the origins of the universe. I remember saying to a minister, I don't get it. I read a book. Okay, see, there's that book theme again, that said there was an explosion known as the Big Bang. But here, and by that he meant the other book, the Bible, it says that God created heaven and earth in 7 days. Which is right? Well, I hope everybody spotted that neither is right, because God actually created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. Unfortunately, the response I got was, nice boys don't ask that question. A light went off and I said, Bible doesn't make sense. Science makes much more sense to me, and I just gravitated away from religion. Now, this little incident illustrates a number of things, a couple of which I would like to highlight. One is that what people believe about their origins can have a significant impact on how they live their life and where they spend eternity. Equally important, perhaps even more important, is how we answer people's questions about our origins. It can have a significant impact on how they live their lives and where they spend eternity. Now, if Mr. Brown was the only one to miss out on salvation because of something like this, of course, that would be bad enough, because the Bible tells us that God wants no one to perish. But research tells us that 67% of young people leave the church at age 18 and never return. That's like 2/3. Now, I hope we can all agree that the answer that Dan Brown got really wasn't adequate. But there are some other answers that get used that, while they sound better on the surface, are really just the same kind of brush off. Things like, oh, don't worry about that, just love Jesus. Or, that's just a side issue, it's the gospel that's important. Now, clearly, loving Jesus and the gospel are both very important, but in fact, the gospel has its foundation in Genesis. Here's one way the gospel is expressed, that very familiar verse in John. And here is the connection to Genesis. And here is another important part of that gospel, which has its direct link to Genesis. Because as Paul explains, since by a man, that's like a real man, came death, that's the perishing part of the gospel, so also by a man, another real man, came also resurrection from the dead. That's the eternal life part of the gospel. And then he goes on and says, for as in Adam all die, so there's the real man by which came death, with a direct link back to the events in Genesis. So also in Christ will all be made alive. That's the eternal part, the other man that provides the eternal part of the gospel. And Paul elaborates in Romans. He says, therefore, just as through one man, a man again, sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men. So, according to the biblical account of our origins, after the 6 days of creation, we have this situation. We have the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve and all the animals living together in peace and harmony. And God looked at that and declared it to be very good. However, in the evolutionary account of our origins, mankind doesn't appear on the scene until after millions and millions of years of death and disease and pain and suffering that are recorded in the fossil record. Now, clearly everything in the fossil record is dead, right? And if you look at those bones, you will find instances of bone cancer and clearly carnivory, things that we would not expect God to consider to be very good. Now, this has got some real significant implications for our gospel message. We often express the gospel differently. We say things like, Christ died for our sins, which Paul points out we do because of the sinful nature we have inherited from Adam. We say that Christ's resurrection conquers death, which Paul points out was introduced into the world when Adam sinned. We also say Christ's death and resurrection provide us with the gift of eternal life, which, it points out, we had that eternal life, we had that before Adam sinned. But you can see, if there's no Adam, this really makes no sense. And in fact, the atheists understand that really well. Here's what one of them wrote way back in 1979. He said, Christianity has fought, still fights, and will continue to fight science to the desperate end over evolution. Now, I'd like to just pause there briefly and highlight how he has expressed this as a fight between Christianity and science. There is actually no such fight. In fact, the Christian worldview is now recognized by many historians as being the foundation for being actually able to do science. Because God is a God of constancy, we can expect things to continue to operate in the same way. So it makes sense to study how they operate. And many of the pillars of modern science, guys like Sir Isaac Newton, who many people consider to be the greatest scientist that ever lived, were biblical creationists. But it suits the atheists to express it like this because it immediately puts Christians on the defensive. It makes us seem like we are scientifically illiterate. But that's not true. There is no fight between Christianity and science. But the rest of the stuff, he says, is pretty much spot on. He says, because evolution destroys, utterly and finally, the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. Destroy Adam and Eve and the original sin, and in the rubble, you will find the sorry remains of the Son of God. If Jesus is not the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. So let's go back to Dan Brown's question. He said, I read a book. We don't actually know what the book was. Could have been National Geographic. In my case, it was Scientific American. That's what it was that caused me to become an atheist for a period of time. These days, it could be TV programs. And not necessarily just TV programs on PBS and Discovery Channel. It's amazing how many TV shows have some sort of side-by-the-way allusion to evolution as being a fact. Some reference to some human behavior that is just a result of our millions of years of evolution. He said he read this book, It said there was an explosion known as the Big Bang. Now, what he didn't specifically say, but what's implied by making a reference to the Big Bang, is that the universe happened by chance, in an instant, about 14 billion years ago. He went on to say, but here in the Bible, it says that the universe and everything in it was created by God over 6 days, about 6,000 years ago. Now, he asked his question from the point of view of astronomy or cosmology, because that was the nature of the book he read. But somebody else might read a book on geology. They could ask the question this way. I read this book on geology, and it says that the geological features of the Earth are the result of slow and gradual local deposition and erosion over millions or billions of years. But here in the Bible, it says that the geological features of the Earth are the result of a catastrophic global flood about 4,500 years ago. Somebody else might have an interest in paleontology, fossils. They might put it this way. I read a book that said that life started by accident, descended from a common ancestor over billions of years. Oops. But here in the Bible, it says that life was created by God, each after its own kind, about 6,000 years ago. And then there's the area of genetics or biology. Somebody else could read a book on that and put the question this way. I read a book, and it said that men and ape have a common ancestor, from which they've each evolved over the last 3.5 million years. But here in the Bible, it says that mankind was created in the image of God. Not the image of an ape, about 6,000 years ago. So which is right? Now, before I try and answer these questions, which again are all legitimate questions, I have another question. And I don't ask this to be confrontational or argumentative or anything like that, but simply maybe to get you kind of think about things. And that is, would you be able to answer these questions? If the next Dan Brown came up to you and asked you his question, or one of these, would you be able to give him a scientifically sound, biblically affirming answer? Because think of how the world might have been different, or might be different, if the minister had been able to do that for Mr. Brown. What sort of stories might he have written? And what sort of movies might have been made about those stories? And how many millions of people might have seen those movies? How might the world be different? And really, never mind the next Dan Brown. What about your children or grandchildren? If they happen to be in the public school system, they're being taught evolution as a fact. So you would expect, indeed, hope they might ask you some of these questions. Would you be able to give them scientifically sound, biblically affirming answers? To do that, you'd need to be equipped with the information necessary to be able to provide those answers, and that's what Creation Ministries is all about. It's about getting information to you to equip you to be able to answer those questions, whether they come from your children, your grandchildren, maybe your colleagues at work, or whatever. And we have a number of mechanisms for doing that. One of those is a website. Excuse me. This gives you access to over 10,000 articles that have been written on this topic, covering all the different scientific disciplines, major theological questions as well. There's a new article featured on the website every day, except Sunday. So if you make the website the homepage of your web browser, when you launch your web browser, you'll get an article, you'll get a new article, today's article, you'll be able to see what it is and read it and keep getting equipped with new information. Now, of course, to do that, you need to know the web address. How many people here already log on to the CMI website on a regular basis? Lots of you. The rest of you, make note of those hands, because in case you forget this web address, you'll be able to go and speak to them. Pretty complicated web address. Now, if you get a question to which you don't know the answer, that's okay, but might I suggest, rather than the approach that the minister used with Mr. Brown, you try something like this. You say, you know, that's a very interesting question. I'd never actually thought about that before. Then you rush home, you log onto this website, as long as you can remember the web address. Click on this tab up here, which is Topics. You'll get this page. And if you click on this button, you'll get this page. And that's a list of all of the topics that are covered on the website. Now, that's not the complete list. They wouldn't all fit on one screen. But it's all in alphabetical order, so you can look through it and find the topic that best matches the question you've been asked. And you click on that, you'll get a list of all of the articles on that topic, which you can then read and formulate an answer and go back and say, you know that question you asked me? What do you think about this? Another mechanism we have for getting information into your hands is a free, everybody likes free stuff, right? Email newsletter. And if you're going to sign up for this, it looks like this when it arrives in your mailbox. It gives you a 2 or 3 sentence introduction of a number of articles that have appeared on the website recently, and then a link to that article so you can go directly to it and read it if you find it interesting. So we're now going to pass around some clipboards that have this form on it, and if you could just give us the information that's requested there so that we'd be able to send you these emails. As soon as I get them back to the office, that's what'll happen. If you can keep circulating these clipboards, that'd be great. Now, it's asked for the postal code on here. You may wonder, don't these guys know they don't need postal codes to send email? Yes, we know you don't need postal codes to send emails. The reason we ask for the postal code is so that if there's another CMI event in your area, we will be able to send you an email notifying you about that event. All right, let's go back to the questions. But first, let's give some thought to what our answers ought to be like. And it's not surprising, the Bible actually has some instructions about that. When Jesus was asked what was the first and most important commandment, he said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." God gave us our brains. He expects us to use them. So we need to give some thought to our answers. Our answers need to be thoughtful. They also need to be reasonable, because we're told in Scripture to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. We've got to have reasons for what we believe, and our Christian faith is very reasonable, but we need to be able to express those reasons. We also need, our answers also need to recognize the authority of Scripture, because we're told in Scripture that all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, and for correction. It doesn't say all Scripture except the first 11 chapters of Genesis. That's part of the package. And last but not least, our answers need to recognize the fact of the secular position. In doing this, we'll be, in effect, following Paul's example. Paul was a Jew, so when he was talking to the Jews about Jesus, he could draw on their common culture and common language. And he could use terms that had special meaning to the Jews, and he didn't have to explain what it meant. You know, words like the Messiah. Excuse me, when he tried that with the Greeks, it didn't work so well, did it? They thought he was babbling nonsense. So he changed his approach. He went to their frame of reference. He looked around him and he said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. I see all these altars to all these different gods. In fact, I see one here to the unknown God. Well, let me tell you, I actually know who that is. That's the God that created the universe." And then he took them from creation to the gospel message, showing the connection. Now, I think it used to be, way back in the Dark Ages when I was a kid, that you could consider Canada to be a Christian nation. We had a Christian culture. Not everybody was a Christian, but most people understood what Christianity was all about. So when folks like Billy Graham got up and talked about salvation, special word for Christians, people kind of knew what that meant. I don't think that's the case anymore. I don't think, not only are we not a Christian nation, I don't think most people, or a very large number of people, actually understand anything about Christianity. So when you try and talk to them about the gospel message, it doesn't make any sense to them. They think we're babbling nonsense. But the thing they do know, or think they know, is evolution, because that's what's taught in schools and that's what fills up our media. So they think they know all about that. So what we need to be able to do is, just like Paul, we need to step into their frame of reference and then get them out of that frame of reference and explain to them the gospel of Jesus Christ. All right. So that's pretty simple, right? That's questions. Answers aren't going to be hard. Now, creation or evolution, which is right? Well, what do the data say? When everybody is on about making data-driven decisions these days, so what did the data say? Well, here's some data. What did they say? They speaking to anyone? No, you see, contrary to popular opinion, data don't speak for themselves. They need to be interpreted. To interpret data, you need to understand the interpretive framework. And here's the interpretive framework for these data. They're part of a 3-country survey about people's beliefs about human origins. The 3 countries were the US, the UK, and Canada. These are the Canadian results. Now, I'm not going to kind of talk to them in any great detail, but I'd like to use them to illustrate how when you know what the interpretive framework is for the data, you can actually extract very interesting pieces of information from the data. For example, these 2 numbers tell us that Canadian women are wiser than Canadian men. And these 3 numbers tell us that older Canadians are wiser than younger Canadians. So if you put those 2 things together, it's pretty logical to conclude that the wisest Canadians are the older women. Does everybody agree with that? Guys, yes, you agree with that. I certainly do, because my wife's a bit older than I am, so I've known it for a long time. Here's another interesting number. It's the same percentage of young people that leave the church at age 18 and never return. Notice the age group. So just maybe their decision has something to do with the fact they believe they're just simply rearranged pond scum. All right, data don't speak for themselves. They need to be interpreted. For that, you need an interpretive framework, and the nature of that interpretive framework will depend on presuppositions. These are things that are just assumed to be true. Good example of that, I think, is the courtroom. In the courtroom, we have one set of data. They call it the evidence. But we have 2 interpretations of that data based on 2 different presuppositions. One interpretation is based on the presupposition that the defendant is guilty. That's the prosecution's. The other interpretation is based on the presupposition that the defendant is innocent. That's the defense. What the jury is supposed to do is examine the evidence, listen to these 2 interpretations, decide which one best explains the evidence, and therefore which underlying presupposition is most likely correct. And you know what? That approach works really well in this question of which is true, creation or evolution. In making the assessment of the evidence, we need to be aware of some things about science that I think people often forget about. One is there's actually 2 different kinds of science. There's what we call operational or experimental science, which deals with how the universe operates. And then there's this stuff called historic or forensic science, which has to do with events that happened in the past. Now, operational science is the kind of science we learn in high school. It's all about doing experiments. It's kind of science that goes on in laboratories around the world every day. It's the kind of science that results in all of our technological gadgets and all our medical advances. It's all about verifying things by repeated experiment. Or it's about, if you like, what we can actually see and measure. Historical or forensic science, which we're all familiar with if we watch any of the crime TV shows, is about something that happened in the past. So we can't verify it with another experiment. It's not verifiable. In fact, what it is, it's a story about the past, which makes it history. And what that story tries to do is explain what it is we can currently see and measure. But that story, constructing that story, involves a lot of speculation. And the nature of that speculation will depend on the presuppositions of the speculator. If we're looking at this fossilized critter and you're an evolutionist, your presupposition is that evolution is true, you'll be trying to fit it into some evolutionary chain. If you're looking at that fossilized critter and you're a biblical creationist, you'll say, oh, it's a critter that got buried in the global flood. Same evidence, different interpretation because of your different presuppositions. And these presuppositions are really important because they can actually preclude you from getting the right answer. Consider the 747. Operational science tells us how it flies. But knowing how the 747 flies tells us absolutely nothing about how the 747 came into existence. Just like knowing how our cells operate actually tells us nothing about how cells came into existence. So, how did the 747 come into existence? Well, there was a famous mathematician who once said the probability that life happened by accident is about the same as the probability that a tornado would go through a junkyard and leave a 747 behind. Well, they want us to believe that life did happen by accident, right? I mean, that's the whole foundation of evolution, that life happened by accident. So I guess we can legitimately consider this to be one of the possible ways the 747 came to be. But if you think maybe that's a bit of a stretch, then we should perhaps do this slowly and gradually over a long period of time by increments. So we have a tornado go through the junkyard and leave a simple part of the 747, the undercarriage. Then after some period of time, maybe a few million years, another tornado comes along, goes through the same junkyard and adds a bit of complexity. And if we wait long enough, at least this is the way the story goes, we'll eventually get a 747. But there is actually a third option. Some engineers do some design work and create a set of design specifications for the 747. Then some more engineers do some more design work and develop a set of processes by which the 747 can be made. Then some more engineers do some more design work and design and build a factory in which those processes can be implemented, and then a whole bunch of people go into the factory, implement those processes, and make a 747. So, we have these three options: accidentally, all at once; accidentally, slowly and gradually, by increments over a long period of time; and by design. But if somebody now imposes the presupposition that we must explain everything using only natural processes, using only the laws of physics and chemistry, you can't even consider that as the possible way the 747 came into existence, because it involves processes like design and manufacturing that aren't part of the laws of physics and chemistry. So if we look at the evidence, which is the 747, through an interpretive framework that doesn't limit the scope of your answer, it's pretty clear it happened by design. But if you are forced to explain how the 747 came into existence using only natural processes, you have to conclude something like it happened by accident. It's the only option you've got. That doesn't make it true. It's just the only option you have because of your presupposition. So the answer you get will depend on your presupposition that you start with. And I submit it's pretty much the same thing in this question of creation or evolution. We look at the evidence, and there isn't evidence for creation and evidence for, separate evidence for evolution. It's kind of like a court case. There's just evidence. It's how you interpret the evidence that's different. If you interpret that evidence through an interpretive framework that doesn't limit your explanation, it's pretty clear that it was all created. I mean, even Richard Dawkins. Everybody know who Richard Dawkins is? Very outspoken, anti-Christian, atheistic evolutionist in the UK. Said in one of his books, he's written a lot of books about this topic, said in one of his books that biology was the study of complex things that looked like they were designed for a purpose. Well, you know, maybe the reason they look that way is, just like the 747, which looks that way, it's because they were designed for a purpose. But Dr. Dawkins says, no, we have to explain everything using only natural processes. Well, if you do that, then you're pretty much forced to come up with something like evolution. Just as in the case of 747, that doesn't make the answer right. It's the only answer you have. It's the only option you have. Okay, let's go back to these questions. Now, if we look at the questions, there's something common to each column that's different between the column, and that's time. All of these evolutionary explanations involve millions and billions of years, whereas this explanation involves only a few thousand years. So where did these millions and billions of years come from? I mean, if you just read the Bible, they're not there. You go through those chronogenealogies, you know, Adam lived to be 130 and had Seth who lived to be whatever. You work all of that out, it's only about 6,000 years. Well, they've actually been around for a long time, but most recently, they're generally attributed to this gentleman. He was a Scot and an amateur geologist. He lived about 100 years before Darwin wrote his book, and he himself wrote a book on geology in which he said, the past history of our globe must be explained by what we can see to be happening now. This is a presupposition. He didn't derive this from the data. He is imposing this idea on the interpretation of the data. He goes on to say, no powers are to be employed that are not natural to the globe. No action to be admitted except those of which we know the principle. Okay, so another presupposition he is imposing on the interpretation of geological evidence. It's what's called uniformitarianism. because it assumes that what we can see to be happening now is always what has happened. So in particular, since we don't see global floods these days, there clearly never was a global flood, according to this. They're not allowed to entertain the idea that there might have been a global flood, even if it is the best explanation for the observations, because it doesn't follow the presupposition. And it's also naturalistic. It must involve only natural processes. So you can't consider a supernatural global flood as having caused the geological features. This gentleman, who was a contemporary of Darwin's, well, sort of, he really liked this idea, and he himself wrote some geology texts in which he said it was an attempt to explain the former changes on the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. Again, assume that whatever we can see happening today is the only stuff that has ever happened. Now, it turns out he let slip in one of his pieces of private correspondence that he actually had an ulterior motive, which was to free the science of geology from the grasp of Moses. So we got to get away from this interpreting the geological features in terms of a global flood to something else. So how does this work? Well, here's the evidence, like we see in the Grand Canyon. Some really thick layers of rock, and lots of erosion. If we interpret that using the interpretive framework of uniformitarianism based on naturalism, we measure a thickness of a layer of rock. We find out how quickly sediment is being deposited in the ocean today. We do this simple arithmetic, and we find out how long it must have taken to deposit that layer of rock. Or we can look at all of that erosion that's happened in the Grand Canyon. We can measure how fast the Colorado River is eroding today, and we can do this simple calculation and find out how long it must have taken to erode the Grand Canyon. So, for example, the numerator is 1,000 meters, and the denominator is 1 millimeter per year, then it must have taken 1,000,000 years. Except, in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted and demonstrated quite clearly that this isn't correct. Here's a geological feature, a wall of rock that didn't exist before Mount St. Helens erupted. It's actually got 3 different layers. The bottom layer is from the ash precipitating out. Top layer is from a mud flow that happened sometime later. But the interesting layer is this one. You can see how big it is relative to the person down at the bottom. And if you look closely at it, it's made up of many, 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 many fine layers. And the uniformitarian interpretation of this is that these layers were deposited in still water, 1 layer per year. So as the temperature of the water changes over the course of the year, the density changes and its ability to support sediment changes, and so sediment settles out year by year by year. So you want to know how long it took to lay this layer of rock down, you count up the little layers, and you get the answer in years. Except, people watched this happen. And it only took 3 hours, one afternoon, when a huge volume of liquid-like stuff called a pyroclastic flow, full of sediment, flowed very quickly through here, left this behind. And now they've confirmed by doing experiments, good operational science, in things called flumes, that if you've got a large volume of water full of sediment, flowing rapidly and horizontally, it deposits this kind of stuff behind it. So it doesn't take a long time to deposit a layer of rock. It simply takes the right conditions. Here's another geological feature that didn't exist before Mount St. Helens erupted. They call it the Little Grand Canyon because it's got all of the same topological features as the Big Grand Canyon. It's just smaller. And you can see there's a small river here along the bottom, and it's quite a deep canyon. So a uniformitarian geologist would conclude that that small river took a very long time to carve that canyon. But they watched this happen too. And it happened in one afternoon when a large volume of water that had been dammed up as a result of the Mount St. Helens eruption breached the dam, flowed down this area and carved the canyon, and left the river behind. So the river didn't actually cause the canyon. The river is a result of the canyon. So again, it doesn't take a long time to make a canyon. It just takes the right conditions, a large volume of water flowing rapidly. But you might think rocks take a long time to form. Well, here's a rock that probably should call it a stone that some people found on a beach in Australia. Because it looked different than the other stones, they bent over and picked it up, turned it over, and it had a toy car inside. So that obviously didn't take millions of years to form. And in fact, concrete is your archetypical rock. It's got aggregate, a cementing agent, and water, and that's all it takes to make a rock. And concrete gets hard, sets overnight, and reaches its design strength in just 28 days. So it doesn't take millions of years for a rock to get hard. And it's a good job, because otherwise we wouldn't have any skyscrapers, right? We couldn't make anything out of concrete. So it doesn't take a long time for any of this stuff. It just takes the right conditions. And in fact, this guy recognized that. He's known as one of the fathers of modern geology. He was also a churchman, but he lived about 100 years before Hutton. And he enunciated, he was a kind of an amateur geologist, I guess. He enunciated 4 principles of geology, which I've illustrated here, one of which is now turned into a law, the law of superposition. And when you're talking about sedimentary rocks, what this law says is the sedimentary layers at the bottom were deposited first, and then the other ones were put on top. Does everybody understand that? It's a really profound statement, right? The stuff at the bottom was there first. But University of California at Berkeley has a web entry about Steno, in which it says, it should also be remembered that Steno's law is a statement of relative time, not absolute time. 2 rock layers, in principle, could have formed millions of years apart, or a few hours, or days apart. Steno himself saw no difficulty in attributing the formation of most rocks to the flood mentioned in the Bible. Okay, so on the basis of the evidence, it's perfectly consistent with those rock layers being formed by the flood. They don't demand millions and billions of years. All right, if we had a global flood, that would mean we'd have to cover the entire world with water. Do we have enough water for that? Good question. If you were able to be an astronaut, you could look at the world from this perspective, or if you want to go on Google Earth, you can do it too, and you would conclude that maybe the world is mostly water. In fact, 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water, and some of that is in extremely deep and very long trenches, like the Marianas Trench. If you were to push those trenches up, push all the mountains down so you make a kind of a relatively smooth globe, there'd be enough water to make a layer 2.7 kilometers deep all around the world. That calculation, incidentally, as I understand correctly, was done by Jacques Cousteau. So it's not a creationist invention. Now it says in the Bible that during the flood, the water covered all the high mountains, right? Plus another 15 cubits. So how high are mountains? Well, I got my PhD at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and I lived at the foot of Hamilton Mountain. And they do call it Hamilton Mountain, even though the top of it is only 220 meters above sea level. Okay, so that'll be underwater. 100 around, and I found another Hamilton Mountain in Washington State. And I guess because it's an American Hamilton Mountain, it's somewhat taller than the Canadian Hamilton Mountain, over 3 times as tall, but it's still only 700 meters above sea level at the top. I used to live in Calgary, or near Calgary, for a number of years, and I could see the Rockies from our place. And we used to go up there. They were pretty spectacular mountains. People here been to the Rockies, right? Been to Banff? Been to Jasper? Been to Columbia Icefields? Been to Lake Louise? They'd all be underwater. Not so good for Alberta tourism. So, even at their present locations, they'd be underwater. But, of course, the top of Mount Everest would not. 8.85 kilometers in altitude. But if you look at Mount Everest up close, you'll see it's made of sedimentary rock. And if you go up even closer and pick up those rocks, they're full of marine fossils, little itty-bitty critters that don't climb mountains. So when those rocks were laid down, they were underwater. Not at their present altitude, obviously, but they were underwater. During the flood, all the rock layers got laid down, and then these mountains got pushed up as a result of the catastrophic plate tectonics that were going on when the rocks were still soft. And then they got eroded away to form the mountains. Okay, if we had a global flood, that means we got to give some serious consideration to this story about the ark, right? Because the ark had all of the animals on it that survived the flood. So it's natural to ask, and a lot of people do, how did they get all the animals on the ark? Would be difficult if the ark looked like this, which is kind of how we mostly draw it for kids' illustrations. And there's a bunch of animals we usually don't show. Dinosaurs, right? Dinosaurs, air-breathing land animals, therefore they would be on the ark. Of course, the ark didn't actually look like that, it looked like that. There are specs in the Bible for how big the ark was. And built to scale, that would be what it looked like. There's actually a guy in the Netherlands who has built a full-scale model of the ark. It floats in one of the canals somewhere in the Netherlands. There are pictures of it on the CMI website. It's quite amazing. Now, you can do a kind of volumetric calculation, and you can figure out that it has the capacity for the equivalent of 522 boxcars, each of which will hold 240 sheep. That means you could get 125,000 sheep-like animals on the ark. Now, we all think of dinosaurs, I think, as being huge. Anybody here seen Jurassic World? How about Jurassic Park? Most of the dinosaurs in there were really big, right? Because the bigger they are, the scarier they are, right? Then we think of them, the big sauropods and the T-Rexes and stuff, they're all very big. But how do dinosaurs start life? They hatch out of eggs. And one of the largest dinosaur eggs found to date is about the same size as an ostrich egg. So that means, I think the biggest one's about the size of a football. That means that when that dinosaur hatched, it would be about the same size as an ostrich when it hatches. Not all that big. Certainly not as big as an adult ostrich. Now, scientists have looked at dinosaur skeletons and concluded that dinosaurs had a growth habit not unlike humans. In fact, not unlike all the other animals we know of. That is, when they're born, they're small, they stay relatively small for a number of years, then they become teenagers, and they get big all of a sudden, and then they stay more or less that size for the rest of their life. So here's the growth pattern for a typical dinosaur. Here's the teenage growth spurt. Now, you remember that Noah didn't go out and decide which animals he was going to take on the ark. God brought the animals to Noah. So it would make sense for him to bring juveniles. Several advantages. They're small, they don't take up too much space, they don't weigh so much, they don't weigh the ark down, they don't need a lot of food yet, and that has the corollary benefit that they don't produce a lot of manure, which Noah and his family would probably appreciate, don't you think? Then a year later, when they get off the ark, they're still not very big, they still don't need a lot of food, which is probably an advantage, because if you think about it, the whole surface of the world has just been destroyed. And, maybe there's not been enough time yet for a whole bunch of regrowth to feed the herbivores. The carnivores might do all right until they ate up all the herbivores, but we got to keep the herbivores around so that the carnivores have something to eat. So as long as they're small and don't need a lot yet, we're probably okay. Now, in addition to size, the other thing that determines whether there is enough space on the ark or not is how many have to go on. Now, do you remember what it said? How many animals had to go on the ark? 2 of each species? Kind. Yeah, a lot of people think it was 2 of each species. We often get that kind of thing from skeptics. But in fact, it said 2 of each kind. Now, we don't actually know what a kind specifically is, but it obviously had to do with reproduction. Things were to reproduce after their kind. There's been a lot of study about kinds, but there isn't anything definitive about it. But, for example, most scientists, whether evolutionists or creationists, agree that all of the dog-like things that exist on the world today, all of the different breeds of domestic dog and all the different kinds of wolves and foxes and dingoes and jackals and so on, all came from a single pair of wolf-like creatures. They had the genetic diversity to produce all of the things we currently see as canines. So maybe we had a canine kind, and similarly maybe we had a feline kind. So we didn't need didn't need 2 lions and 2 tigers and 2 of this and 2 of that, just 2 felines, and maybe 2 equines. We actually had 8 mankinds, but that was an exception. Okay, so you need to know how many kinds, and it's only air-breathing land animals. Obviously, none of the sea creatures had to go on the ark. None of the insects, none of that they're all pretty small anyway. So when you look through all of that, One guy, this guy, did a very detailed analysis of all that, and he figured out that maybe in total there might have been 50 different kinds of dinosaurs. Things like theropods, for which T-Rex is one of. Things like sauropods, which Brachiosaur is one of. Ankylosaurs, etc., etc. And in total, he figured there might be 16,000 animals. Now, I think he made an overestimate there, but let's go with 16,000. He also looked at all of their growth habits and figured out that only 11% of them would be larger than sheep. That's only 1,760 animals larger than a sheep that'll fit on a vessel that'll hold 125,000 sheep-sized animals. And in fact, he figured out that the median size, that is the size that divides them in half, 50% smaller, 50% larger, would have been about the size of a rat. Now, when I give this talk in Alberta, this is where people say, a what? Now, if you think about the implications of that, after the flood, the ark comes to rest, door opens, everything that's on the ark gets off the ark. That means that people and dinosaurs are walking around on the earth together after the flood. And there's lots of evidence to support that. Here's one piece in a temple in Angkor Wat, or a temple in Cambodia. The temple's name is Angkor Wat. And it's full of lots of intricate carvings. And this one in particular looks just like a stegosaur. Right? Now, the interesting thing is, this temple was completed in 1186, and we didn't find the first Stegosaurus fossil until about 700 years later. So how did the guy who carved the Stegosaurus know what a Stegosaurus looked like, if we hadn't actually figured out what a Stegosaurus looked like yet? Well, one logical conclusion is that people in his culture knew what a Stegosaurus looked like, because somebody in the past had seen one. And it wasn't so long ago that that information couldn't have been reliably passed down, so that he actually knew what a Stegosaurus looked like. And there's tons of evidence. I'll highlight a book later on, a book table that has all kinds of it. From a scientific perspective, we have soft tissue in dinosaur bones. Discovery started with Dr. Mary Schweitzer back in 1994. She cut a slice of T-Rex bone, put it under her microscope, took a look at it, and said it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. This is she reported in Science magazine, very prestigious scientific publication. Here's what she saw. She let the other people in her lab have a look, and they got increasingly excited until somebody blurted out, "You've got red blood cells." Now, I'm pretty sure they all knew Mary Schweitzer had red blood cells. What they meant was, "You've got T-Rex red blood cells." But she said, of course, I couldn't believe it. I said to the technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? Well, in fact, they can't. I had the opportunity to talk to a lady who worked in a hematology lab analyzing veterinary blood samples from animals and around. And she was in New Zealand, in the North Island, and she had to get samples from all over. I mean, she got samples from all over the country, including the South Island. So I said, well, how quickly do you have to get them in order to analyze them before they're no good? And she said, well, I need to get to them within a couple of days of when they're drawn. Otherwise, they're too badly decomposed to do anything with. So 65 million years? That seems a bit of a stretch. Anyway, how does she know they're 65 million years old? What's the evidence? You know, when they find the bones, they don't come with little tags on them that say how old they are. The evidence is the bone and the rock layer in which they find the bone. The age is an interpretation of the age of the rock layer based on its position in the geological column, based on the presupposition of uniformitarian geology. But as we saw from the web article on Steno, they could have been buried 4,500 years ago, in which case the survival of the red blood cells is potentially possible. Now, we're told fossils take a very long time to form. Here's the standard explanation, taken from a museum plaque. In this case, a dinosaur dies in the ocean, falls to the bottom of the ocean, where it lies while its flesh decomposes and is washed away, leaving this perfect skeleton, which slowly over millions of years gets covered up by slow and gradual sedimentation Then the bottom of the ocean gets raised up slowly and gradually over more millions of years, and over even more millions of years, slow and gradual erosion erodes the overburden until the bones are exposed and Mary Schweitzer can come along and discover them. Except when things die in the ocean, they don't sink right away. They float. You would think if anything knew what to do when it died in the water, it would be fish. Now, sure, eventually it'll sink, but not for a while. And while they're on the surface, the flesh decomposes and they get scavenged. Little critters that haven't died come along and eat the flesh. Eventually you're left with just the skeleton. And the skeleton falls to the bottom, but it doesn't stay all together. It becomes all disarticulated and falls all over the place. And then once it's on the bottom, other things come along and scavenge it. Or it simply dissolves. So, how do we explain these kinds of fossils? Exquisite preservation. All the detail, look at that. You can see just everything, including the fact it's giving birth. Now, one would hope that didn't take millions of years, right, lady? Or how about this one, fossilized while it's having lunch? Now, how long does it take a fish to eat another fish? And look at all of the details. The only thing that makes sense for these kinds of fossils, and they're typical of fossils, is that you have fish swimming along quite contentedly. All of a sudden, it's overwhelmed by a fast-flowing undersea current full of sediment. They're called turbidity currents. They're the kinds of things that get thrown up when we have an undersea earthquake. The floor of the ocean goes whoosh, the water goes whoosh, picks up all kinds of sediment, and away it goes. Traps the fish, protects it from predation until the flesh decomposes and disappears, and we have this perfect skeleton, just like we see. Now, you might think that while it could get covered up quickly, it takes a long time for it actually to become permineralized, which is the fossilization process. But that's not the case either. Just takes the right conditions, because here we have a fossilized bowler hat, a fossilized bag of flour, and a fossilized water wheel, none of which have been around for millions of years. As with the deposition of rock and the formation of canyons, doesn't take a long time, just takes the right conditions. These pictures, you can see, I took from something called Creation Magazine. And it's another mechanism. No, not yet. In a minute. This is another mechanism we have for getting information into your hands. And we consider it our #1 mechanism for doing that, because once you subscribe to it, it comes to your house every 3 months. And it brings new information that you can read and absorb and use to equip you to answer questions. I got at least one copy of it out there that if you want to see what it looks like, you can have a look at it. But it has no paid advertising in it, so it's all information content. The articles are small. They range from a couple of paragraphs to a couple of pages, so you can read them, during TV commercials or whenever it's convenient. And it's not like a novel where, you got to remember what you read last week in order to make the story continue. They're all kind of independent things. They're all scientifically accurate. They're written by scientists. They're up to date with the latest stuff that's being published in scientific journals, but they're not written for scientists. They're written for everyday people, so you don't have to have a science background to understand what they're saying. And I got to get a little bit later, we're going to pass around the clipboards again with the opportunity to subscribe, and I'll let you think about that until we get there. I said very early on that many people think that science has proved evolution to be true. Now, in actual fact, science can't prove anything to be true. It can only prove things to be false. But people think that science proves things to be true, and when they think that about evolution, I think they think it's because of the fossil record. So I think we should look at that. Here's a diagrammatic representation of the fossil record. These are the rock layers in the geological column over here. And the other side of the picture shows us where different kinds of fossils show up in the geological column. These things are plants. These things over here are animals. These yellow things in between are sponges and corals. And the dashed lines don't indicate that fossils are missing in particular rock layers. They just indicate different kinds of fossils. Now, a very obvious feature is this. You see, below that, there are essentially no fossils. Those little yellow things that are hanging down there are actually names. So yeah, you can actually see that. The rock layer immediately above that discontinuity is where all the fossils appear. And that rock layer is called the Cambrian. And so this is referred to by paleontologists as the Cambrian explosion, because life just explodes out of nowhere. Here's how one evolutionist describes it. All the major groups of life we know today appear in the Cambrian with no evolutionary ancestors. In rock layers above the Cambrian, no new or different body plans appear. Well, that's actually a double oops to the theory of evolution, because what you would expect from the theory of evolution is the fossilization of some very rudimentary life form, this so-called last universal common ancestor, that then way down deep in the rock layers, that then branches out through very, very many transitional forms, which should in fact dominate the fossil record, but are virtually absent, forming in effect this root of the tree of life, which purports to show how everything evolved from this mythical last universal common ancestor. But if you look at the evidence, there is no root. And in fact, there's no tree. It's more like an orchard. He said there's no new or different body plans appear. We got all the body plans right away in the Cambrian. So what we've got is a bunch of different kinds of things with some variation within the kind, but no transition between kinds. And that's exactly what you would expect from the biblical account of our origins, right? And if we go back to the website, the University of California at Berkeley website, it's got some more about Mr. Steno. He says, Steno, noticed that of the two major rock types in the Apennine Mountains, the lower layers had no fossils, while the upper ones were rich in fossils. He suggested that the upper layers had formed in the flood, after the creation of life, while the lower ones had formed before life had existed. So again, you see, the evidence doesn't demand evolution. The evidence is perfectly consistent with the biblical account of our origins. It's only because they've imposed a restrictive presupposition on the interpretation of the data. All right, so here we are back at the questions now. We've looked at some of the evidence. And we've looked at evidence in geology. That is what you would expect from the biblical account, but not what you would expect from the evolutionary account. We've looked at evidence from paleontology, which is just what you would expect from the biblical account, but not what you would expect from the evolutionary account. And if we had time, and in fact we do this afternoon, we're going to look at the other two areas and see exactly the same thing. So one wonders why there's any question as to which is right. Now we're told in the Bible, as we noted earlier, to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks us, to give the reason for the hope that we have. There is a second half for that verse, which is that we do it with gentleness and respect. So you don't bang people upside of the head with a 2x4, not recommended. That's a kind of a passive thing. We sit around until somebody asks us a question, and then we provide an answer. But there's also a more active admonition, that is that we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, which I submit this question of evolution really does, because it contradicts the Word of God. But there's also a second half for that verse, so we need to do that carefully as well. Now, to do either of these, we need to be equipped with information. Now, I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but it's true. If we don't have the information to answer a question, how do we formulate an answer? And during the course of today, we're going to talk about a lot of information, but we all know what will happen. Right? You'll go home at the end of the day, and you will immediately start forgetting it. How much of what you learned today or hear today will you remember tomorrow or next week or next month? This guy actually did some experiments to quantify how really good we are at forgetting stuff. But we also know, having gone to school, that if we really want to pass the exam with good marks, it helps to review. Because the more we review, the more we remember, and the less we forget. And the more you review, that's what happens. Which is why we think this is our number one tool for getting information into your hands, because you have it in hand. you don't have the information to review, you can't do the review. But with Creation Magazine, you have the information right there, and you can read it whenever to review it. Now, it used to be, when we got to this point in the talk, things got very tense because I had to talk about money stuff, and you had to make decisions about things, many decisions. You had to decide first whether or not you wanted to subscribe to the magazine. Second, whether or not you wanted to subscribe for 1 year or 3 years. Third, whether or not you also wanted the digital version. And finally, you had to pass over some money. We've changed all of that now, so that we do have to talk a little bit about money, but the only decision you have to make today is whether or not you want to subscribe to the magazine. We run it now like Netflix. Everybody know Netflix? You get Netflix out here? Yeah? Sorry, I couldn't resist. We run it like Netflix. So what we get from you today is, yes, I want to subscribe, and here's where you can take my subscription from, either a credit card or a voided check. And the cost of the subscription is $7.50 every 3 months. To put that in perspective, that's $2.50 a month. Now, Netflix is about $8 a month, I think. And I don't know exactly what the price is here in Saskatchewan, Manitoba. I haven't driven that far. But in Ontario, $2.50 a month will get you a medium coffee and a muffin at Tim's. No, not a muffin, a donut at Tim's. Okay? So it's a really good deal. It's not very expensive. And you not only get the hard copy in the mail, you get the digital copy, which is downloadable on up to 5 devices. So you don't have to pay extra to get that. So if you've got a family with a bunch of digital natives, each with their own digital device, they don't have to wait around for the print copy. They can read it on their smartphone or their tablet or their laptop. And in addition, you get a free DVD that you can take home today and start watching tonight. Okay, clipboard people, it's time to pass the clipboards around again. This time it should have this form on it, and the idea is you tear off the bottom part of the form, the one that's at the bottom of whatever the form there is, fill out the front and the back with the information that's requested, and bring it to me or the person at the table, and once we've confirmed that all of the information is there, you'll get your free DVD. Now, in addition to that, you probably noticed when you came in, there's lots of other resources out there. I want to highlight a couple of them. This one would be excellent if you want to get equipped to provide answers, because it's full of answers. It's got the answers to the 60 most frequently asked questions that CMI speakers have had over the decades that CMI has been doing this. If you want to get equipped to demolish arguments, this would be an excellent book, because that's what it does. There are several areas where evolution is thought to be invincible. You know, things like mutations and natural selection. They're supposed to be the engines that drive evolution. But in fact, all of these areas are like Achilles' heel. Evolution is actually very invincible in these areas, and that's what this book does. It demolishes those arguments that allegedly support evolution. And now there are a number of packages in which the evolution Achilles' heels comes in a book form, and there's a companion DVD, which is not just the guys that wrote the book reading their chapter. It's got other kind of cool stuff like computer graphics and everything in it. And if you'd like to get them both, they're combined in a pack at a reduced price. Then there's this book, which I alluded to earlier, which has got all of the evidence, or a lot of evidence, about the fact that humans and dinosaurs coexisted on the earth after the flood. And of course, there's the InfoBytes newsletter. If you didn't sign up for that before, of course, we'll be here all day, so you can get your name on the list still. And the website with that complicated web address. But the important thing is to become equipped so you can, in fact, do these two things. And that's the end of phase 1. I don't know. Stand on my head, I can't do.
We're a group of people, we're kind of eccentric, and we like the odd story. I noticed the first 2 books had a guy by the name of Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. Now, he's from New Zealand, and he's a chess champ, right?
Yep.
Who did he play in Russia?
Well, he didn't play him in Russia, he played him in New Zealand, but he played Boris Spassky to a draw. Jonathan is an absolutely amazing guy. He knows more stuff about more things than anybody I've ever met. But one of the things he does, he was a New Zealand chess champion, and so he played chess, right? And he had the opportunity to play Boris Spassky, and he played him to a draw. Boris Spassky was the world champion chess guy, if you don't know the name. So, I mean, that's pretty... playing to a draw isn't quite as good as playing to a win, but it's effectively the same thing. You play somebody like Spassky to a draw, you're a really good chess player. Jonathan also plays people blindfolded. Yeah. At one of the super conferences that CMI did, he played 13 players blindfolded, and I think he beat them all. So what would happen was, you know, Jonathan sits here in a chair with a blindfold on, looking the other way, and they all sat out there. And the rules of the game were you couldn't move until the caller came around to be your turn. So there's a person who told Jonathan what the moves were. And there's a special way to do this. You know, you name the chess piece and the square it's on, and then you go name the square to which it's going. And all the squares on the chessboard have names and da-da-da-da. So the idea is the guy had come around in front of you, you'd make your move. He'd tell Jonathan what you'd done. Jonathan would tell him where to move his piece, he'd move it, and then he'd go to the next one. And Jonathan, so he had all of these 13 chess games in his head somewhere. And he was going, and I heard the story, I don't know whether it's true or not, but it sounds cool, that somebody knocked one of the chessboards and knocked some of the pieces over and around. So they tried to put them back where they thought they were. Then when they came back around and it was time to move again, they made a move, and Jonathan said, that can't be right. Because they got the chess pieces back in the wrong place.
And if you go online, type in people with the top IQ on the planet, on that list of top 10, or you would be on that list. No, you would have Gary Kasparov, or Gary Fisher, who's the Kasparov. Chess champs are often the top.
Oh, yeah.
So, Jonathan was the kind of guy you might want to have coffee with. When you go to New Zealand, see if you can do it. Anyway.
Well, Jonathan actually isn't in New Zealand anymore. Jonathan moved to be in the United States, so he's in the Atlanta office. And actually, if I can just kind of elaborate a little bit more, what the very first official function I ever did with CMI was to be, if you like, Jonathan's minder on a cross-Canada tour. He flew into Vancouver. I lived in Calgary at the time. I met him there, and we went across Canada, wound up down in southwestern Ontario. And so I got to, you know, travel in airplanes with him and listen to him talk. And he's an amazing guy. I mean, any of those books out there that have Jonathan Sarfaty's name on them, or any that you see on the website, they are well worth the read. They are just outstanding books. He's written one recently. They didn't send me any for some reason. It's a commentary on the first 11 chapters of Genesis, combining theological, scientific, and something else, perspectives. So you know, he kind of goes through the first 11 chapters almost verse by verse and explains everything. It's just an awesome book.
Well, thank you. Jonathan, maybe your next speaker. Well, let's have